Hello, everyone. Saw some people in here, so I thought I would open up the room. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. And if there are any questions throughout, I highly encourage using the chat function or the Q&A, whichever works best for you. And I will either get to them during the presentation or towards the end. But we'll wait a couple more minutes. I have a lot to share, so I'll probably start pretty much right on time. Using a new webinar function with our new program. So I'm going to do my best to have smooth sailing as we go through. I will start off just with some preliminary stuff before we get in. So to reiterate, please do type in any questions. I like to speak to what you guys want to hear more about. I love examples that you can throw in, things that you want me to talk through. Don't feel like you are catching me off guard at all. They're actually very useful for me to make this presentation more meaningful to you. So I encourage throwing in questions and examples that you'd love for me to talk through. And on that same front, if it's something that I don't get to, I might just be strategically waiting for the right time. If there are very particular questions, I may not address them, but I will be sure to reach out afterwards so that maybe we can set up a one-on-one. One other thing I'm just throwing into the chat now, and I will throw in again later, it's a feedback form. I always love getting feedback. So I'll share it again towards the end of the presentation. But if for whatever reason you need to hop off, it's a great thing to do. It helps me do my job better, but it also asks about any other future presentations you may want to hear about, or topics you'd want explored. The last one I did, someone said, can we do something more on the executive functions in general? And look at the webinar we're doing. So I do read them. They really, really are beneficial. So with that being said, we are going to jump right in. So today we're discussing mastering the mind, understanding executive functions for success. The past couple of topics have been very specific on specific executive functions. We've done some on goal-directed persistence, which we'll talk about more today. I've done some other ones that really were looking into particular executive functions. And I've realized it's been so long since I've done an overview of executive functions. And so let's dive in. For anyone that has attended any of my webinars in the past, I always like to just start off with an agenda and making sure we're speaking the same language. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about executive functions on a very high level, what they are. We'll then move into the difference between executive function capacity and then strategy development. We'll then talk about how executive functions impact learning, work, and daily life. And then we're going to wrap up of going into strategies to support the various executive functions that we talk about. So what are executive functions? Executive functions are the CEO of the brain. So they often are referred to as kind of what holds everything together in making things work. Just like a CEO in a company might not do a lot of the particular tasks that make that company produce widgets or make things. They are the ones that enable it all to work together. And so really executive functions come down to goal-directed behaviors. They are the behaviors and cognitive strategies that help us move towards goals. So they really are self-management skills, and they're based in the prefrontal cortex. And we'll talk a little bit about the development of these. But what we're looking at is executive functions help us determine where to go, how to get there efficiently, and then while we're on the way, how to problem solve and adapt to keep us moving towards the goal. And so I always like to use the example of like going on a road trip. Remember back we used to print out from MapQuest, oh, these are the directions. But then you'd hit a traffic jam or there'd be a detour. Now those directions don't really matter anymore. What do we do? What do we do with our printed out directions? And so Google Maps nowadays on our phones that are connecting, that really give us live GPS, live feedback, this is much closer to a comparison of what executive functions are. It's not just setting a plan in the beginning and then everything goes according to plan. A key piece of executive functions is reacting to our environment, taking in additional feedback and making adjustments along the way to keep us moving towards those goals that we set. And so with this, I wanted to just share over some ideas around models of executive functions. So if you speak to 10 different professionals, you may get 10 different models or lists of executive functions. They may have different names than other ones have. A big one that I always think about is inhibitory controls, which we'll talk about. And then you may hear emotional regulation, and you may hear different iterations, impulse control. And the point I wanted to share here is they can all be correct, but they're approaching describing these more abstract functions in our brain in different ways. And that's okay. They can all be right. And so at New Frontiers, we use a particular model that we find is useful in coaching our clients. We find that it is a way that's actionable. You can set up strategies, they make sense, but that doesn't mean our way is the only way. And we don't believe that. We learn from a lot of other scholars. And so what I'm going to present over is not the textbook explanation of executive functions, because there isn't a single model of executive functions. So I'm going to present over the New Frontiers model on a high level, and then we're going to go into more specifics on them. So first off, there's pre-executive skills. They're not really their own executive functions, but they're important as part of the conversation. And these pre-executive skills include metacognition, which is thinking about how you think, understanding strengths and weaknesses, and then being able to use those. Then we have goal setting. And so if you remember, I said executive functions are goal-directed behaviors. And so if you don't have goals, how do you direct your behaviors toward that goal? And so if you remember when I said executive functions, excuse me, are looking at the best way to get to our goals. Metacognition is a pre-executive skill because it's informing what's the best way for us to get to our goal. And then goal setting is a pre-executive skill because it's where am I going? Then we move on to these core executive functions, and these tend to be pretty agreed upon of executive function skills that often can be identified in the brain, and you can actually see them and measure them. And so these include three, and the first is inhibitory controls. This is when you're thinking about things like controlling your impulses, of being able to understand when to act, when not to act, and being able to reduce distractions. We then have working memory. And so within working memory, it's similar to short-term memory, but it's not just repeating information and remembering information. It's being able to then work with that information in an accurate way. And cognitive flexibility is the ability to be able to think differently and approach problems in different angles, take different perspectives. And so these are core executive functions because they really do help out with establishing these higher order executive function skills, which we're going to talk about in the next two sections. So then we have something that we like to refer to as structural executive functions. And I sometimes refer to these as the enablers. These enable success, not enablers in the negative connotation, but rather that they're enabling success. They're establishing foundations for success. And so we have planning, we have prioritizing, we have time management, and we have organization. And so while these aren't really, while we're working towards tasks, they help set up a firm foundation for when we are working towards our goals. They help kind of set everything up for success. And then the last category is what I like to refer to as the active executive functions. These are the doers. These are while we're in action. These are executive functions are being used in tasks, and they help us achieve those goals in the moment. And so we have task initiation, getting started on things when we want to. Cognitive or task shifting. So this is shifting what we're doing in the moment, shifting between one way of thinking to another way of thinking. So this is very close to cognitive flexibility, but cognitive flexibility is more the ability to think in different ways and different perspectives, whereas cognitive task shifting is the actual changing of gears. So to use the car example, just to separate these, cognitive flexibility is having a car with stick shift, and then cognitive task shifting is the actual shifting between the different gears. So one is the capability and flexibility to be able to do something, and then the cognitive task shifting is the actual shifting between either tasks or lines of thinking. We also have self-monitoring. And so with self-monitoring, this is reflecting on how we are progressing towards our goals. Are we on the right track? This is almost like our smoke detector of, do we need to make any adjustments? And then we have goal-directed persistence. And so goal-directed persistence is really that stamina to keep pushing through towards the end of achieving a goal. And so this can be on two levels, which we'll look a little bit more into. So on one level, it could be the micro goal-directed persistence. Okay, guys, I only have about 50 more minutes in this presentation. I can make it through. I can make it through. Versus the more long-term of, okay, it's only February, but I have 10 more presentations through this year to do. I'm going to be able to get through it. It's not a big deal. I'll be able to push through and not give up on that macro goal that I may have for myself. And so let me pause. We like to break these executive functions out into these different categories because it helps us be able to focus on where problems are so that we can better develop strategies. But a lot of these overlap. It's like a very complex Venn diagram of different executive functions influencing one another. And so on this next slide that I'm going to go into, we are going to be looking at a progression model of how they fit together, but it's not always linear, but I find it's useful in helping people understand how these fit together. So we'll get to the full model after I go through each of these individually. So first off, with pre-executive skills. As I mentioned, metacognition is thinking about thinking. It's understanding your strengths and weaknesses, and it's then applying this information effectively. And so what we often see is when someone's struggling, what's the first thing people sometimes do? Is they'll go onto Google and they'll look up top 10 strategies to get started on tasks. And while those top 10 lists can be helpful, what it's missing in that equation is, well, what's best for me? That top 10 list may be best for 10 other people's brains. But metacognition is really this piece of learning and thinking about, how does my brain work? And how am I going to take a strategy and adapt it so that it actually works for me? And so we see this a lot with students, let's say, where they look at how their peers are studying. That might be a great strategy for someone else, but is it the best study strategy for my brain and how my brain works? If someone's more of a visual learner and they try to use a more auditory study style just because it works for their friends, there's a metacognition gap there of not really seeing that, wait, that strategy may not be playing to my strengths. It may be leaning into weaknesses. And so that's where metacognition really fits in. And so I used a study strategy example, but metacognition is core for getting started on tasks with initiation, with planning out. A great example that I'll share is like when I was working with someone on how were they going to use their calendar so that they knew what they could do and what they should do at different times. And what he quickly noticed is that if he broke out every task into his calendar, he got very overwhelmed. What if I fall behind schedule? Like, what do I do if I finish early? It just caused anxiety. And so he knew that the way his brain works is seeing everything he needed to do broken out into the specifics caused anxiety and was detrimental to achieving his goals, versus more time blocking, of blocking out large amounts of time just to do a list of tasks. That landed much better for him. And so that was metacognition developing, of thinking about what sets his brain up for success. We then have goal setting. And so goal setting is really that defining of clear and achievable objectives. And so doing so also with clarity, realism, and purpose. And sometimes that purpose piece is missing a lot with people. And so whenever I'm coaching, I always try to break out, we don't like should goals. I should do this. I should care. I should study more. I should wake up and go to the gym every day. Should is filled with guilt, and it might not be tied to your purpose. And so really looking at this as pre-executive skills, whenever I'm talking to people, I try to break out, like, really, really goal setting is so important. And when we're talking about other executive function challenges, I try to piece out if there are certain aspects of their lives where they are using executive functions and executive function strategies. And I try to understand what that goal is. What goal are they using those executive functions for? And so sometimes it might not be executive function deficits. It's really just a goal setting challenge of, are we making meaningful goals with purpose for ourselves? And so goal setting is not dreams and aspirations. Goal setting is the translation of dreams into action plans to make them into reality. And it's a learned skill. It's not something you have or you don't have. And so these lay the foundation for the goals that you're working towards and the best ways to get there. Now to go through the core executive functions. So we have inhibitory controls. And so this is really about paying attention to what you want to. So this is being able to, and there's two types of stimuli I like to talk about. So one is external stimuli. So these can be distractions. An example I love to share over is like if you were at a cocktail hour at a wedding, you know, that din of noise in the background, that's a lot of people talking. And so now you're talking to one person. You are trying to inhibit all of the other noise so that you can hear the person you're having a conversation with. Your goal in that example is to have a conversation with this person. And so your inhibitory controls come in by limiting the distractions of all of that other talking. And I'm sure many of you, if you've been to a cocktail hour, then you might see someone that you haven't seen in 20 years. And so then it's, oh, you get distracted in that moment. Or you might try out different strategies to really focus. You may lean in so you can hear them. But that is tapping into this executive function of inhibitory controls. But I do like to also point out that inhibitory controls can also have an impact on ruminating thoughts. So it's not always external stimuli. Sometimes it's internal thinking. And that's where the impulse control piece comes in. Just because you have a thought that comes in doesn't mean you act on it right away. And so inhibitory controls help us say, that's not important right now. I'll get back to that. Working memory is retaining and manipulating information in real time. And so a big example, like the most concrete example that many people have gone through is trying to do math in your head. So when you're saying in your head, carry the one, do this, and you're trying to do like 107 minus 33. So, okay, it's 107 minus 3. That gives me 104. Then 104 minus 30, 74. When you do all of that in your head, you're manipulating that information. And so working memory is the executive function where you take in information, work with it in some fashion, and then you produce something with it, some type of output. And so it's not just short-term memory. It's a bit more oomph to it. So like a very real world example might be if you told someone, hey, can you do these 3 things while you're out? So what you're doing is you're asking them to hold 3 pieces of information, go and do those tasks while still holding on. So I did the first task. Okay, what are the other 2 I need to do? Okay, now I did the second one. What's the third one I need to do? You're working with that information that's given to you. Don't worry, I'm saving strategies towards the end. So we will get into specific strategies for each of these. Lastly was cognitive flexibility, as I mentioned, and this is really about adapting thoughts and actions in response to changing situations. And so this might be, what's the way you drive home from work? And is that the only way? Can you drive home from work a different route? Oh my God, which way is it taking me? This isn't the way you're supposed to get home. That might be some cognitive flexibility challenges. And so if you use the term someone's being rigid ever, that often is a challenge within the executive function of cognitive flexibility. Now, what we're going to see as we continue on to some of these, what people refer to as higher order executive functions, the ones that will be coming on future slides, they're going to tap into different pieces of these, and they're going to be different iterations of them. And so this is where things can start getting murky of overlap between the executive functions. These are 3 very distinct ones, though, that do influence each other. So they're the core skills that all other executive function skill areas stem from. So now the structural executive functions, the enablers of success. So planning is really looking at outlining steps and strategies to achieve the goals. What are all the steps that I need to do? People often think of planning as part of time management, and you can argue that it is part of time management. We like to separate it out, though, because planning really is looking at both planning out your time, planning out tasks, planning out long-term goals, breaking things down, learning to break tasks down into multiple steps. And so it really is this aspect of what is everything I need to do. To use another academic example, it might be, I have to write an essay. Well, that's not very helpful, right? Okay, sit down, write an essay. Well, no, that's not functional. You can't really plan around that. Versus, okay, I have to write an essay, and so I need to make sure I've read everything I need to do for that. I need to outline and pull out necessary information that I can cite in that. Then I need to turn that outline into a draft. Then I need to edit my draft. So we're breaking down a larger task into steps that then can be planned and allocated throughout. And this works very closely with prioritizing. It's great if you have a plan, but now when do we do it? What order? What's important? And so prioritizing is determining the importance of tasks and activities. And then it ties together with planning with the time function on it. So it's great that it's very important, but I don't have to do it for 6 months. So I have some time. It's then that piecing together based off of that importance factor. Then we have time management. And so allocating time effectively to balance competing priorities. This is where sometimes we can be a little different than some other professionals in the field. But we really like to look at time management as two aspects: time awareness, like that awareness of time, and also time estimation. And so time management, how do you manage yourself? Well, this, I always like to share this. You don't manage time. It's a misnomer. What you do is you manage yourself, your self-management in the context of time. And so key components to be able to manage yourself in the context of time is being aware where time is going in the moment. So right now I'm using a lot of time management to keep track of where I'm at in this presentation. I have 35 minutes left. So am I at the right place that I need to be? That's time awareness. If you're having the best time of your life and you're like, oh my God, 25 minutes went by, your time awareness is a little impacted there. The other end is estimation of time. And so in order to manage yourself in the context of time, you need to be able to understand how long things take. And so while I go through a presentation, I don't typically time myself in a practice run, because my estimation of how much content I'm covering has been refined over doing a lot of presentations. So I know how long it's going to take me. I probably just jinxed myself, and now I'm going to run out of time on this one. Next, we have organization. And I will say, you talk to some scholars, they'll just say organization is not an executive function, but it is often one of the #1 things people ask about. So we do include it in the model. It really tends to be more of a time management strategy. And the reason why I'd like to share that over is organization is the structuring of your resources or thoughts systematically for efficiency. So someone may have a messy room, but if they never lose anything, and if they're always able to get places on time, is it really a problem? Maybe that's working for them. And so it might just not be your organization system, but what's the purpose of being organized? Now, what does happen a lot is there are impacts on mental health from for some people, being disorganized. A messy desk causes anxiety. And so there are other aspects as well. But really, when we're looking at organization, you don't really just do these things to do these things. It's in relation to that end goal. And so maybe a goal of yours is to get places on time. And if you're disorganized, you might lose things and then you're running late. And that's where it really is an executive function skill, because being organized can help direct you towards your goals. So these skills help us be the most productive and efficient when we get down to doing the tasks needed to accomplish goals, which brings us to the active executive functions, the doers. So first off is task initiation. So this is starting tasks efficiently and promptly. I see a little typo there, but also when you want to. And so I know a lot of people say they struggle with time management, planning, prioritizing. And through some conversations, what I quickly find out is they're great at planning. They're great at using a calendar. They're great at prioritizing, but they can't get started when they want to. So great, it says go to the gym at 7 a.m. It's in their calendar. But when it comes to 7 a.m., they just can't get themselves activated and going. They can't initiate. So I like to always compare this over to, it's like you want to go to the food store, you get in your car and you don't have your keys. You have every intention to get there. You were ready to start. You wanted to, but you didn't have the tool to actually turn that car engine over and get going. Cognitive and task shifting, so transitioning smoothly between tasks or thought processes. So, oh, great, I don't have my keys in the car. Let me go inside and go look for them, versus getting stuck in the car and not being able to shift from that and trying to figure out how to make it work. And this becomes very important because it's, let me get to the next one. Self-monitoring. So self-monitoring is evaluating your progress and adapting strategies as needed. So that adapting strategies as needed taps into the cognitive task shifting. So, for example, if I was working on this presentation throughout all of last week and I was doing one slide a day, and it was Tuesday of last week, okay, well, that means I would get to 7 slides. Self-monitoring would be saying in my brain, wait, I'm not on track to achieve my goal at this pace. We need to make some adaptation to be able to achieve this goal. And so that would tap into some of that cognitive task shifting of 1 slide a day isn't enough. I need to shift up what I'm doing and do things a little bit differently. So self-monitoring is that ability to know there's a problem, or know things are going great, right? Things are going really well, but it's that reflection on how are things going. I will also just quickly say self-monitoring is such a key executive function in informing metacognition, informing whether strategies are working or not. It's often one of the first things we do try to work on in coaching is building up self-monitoring skills, because it doesn't matter if everyone else knows that something's not working. If you yourself don't see that something's not working, it's going to be very hard to convince you to change what you're doing. And so building self-monitoring systems is really core to working on a lot of the strategies that we work on in coaching, and then you may work on yourself as you're moving yourself forward. And then goal-directed persistence. So this is maintaining focus and effort towards achieving tasks and goals. And as I mentioned earlier, this can be both micro, 29 more minutes to make it through, 29 more minutes. You got this, Casey. You got this, Casey. Versus the more macro of, I haven't seen the results yet. I from doing these presentations monthly, but I'm going to keep doing it. Keep doing it. It's progress. I'm making progress and keeping yourself moving and persisting through those times to get to that end goal. So now, as promised, quickly, these skills do help us while we're actively doing something. They keep us on track and moving forward. So as promised, let's bring it all together. And as I mentioned earlier, when I thought I was coming up earlier, things don't always happen sequentially in the way that I'm going to present it over, but I find it as a useful way to kind of bring this all together and visualize it. I'm a very visual learner. And so I find it useful as another way of presenting over how this all fits together. And so pre-executive skills of metacognition and goal setting help inform the goal, right? So being able to know how to set good goals, but then also how you set those goals for them to be meaningful and achievable. You need to have some metacognition to understand how your own brain works. Is this possible for me to achieve? Is this setting the goal too far? Is this setting the goal too, am I hedging too much and being too comfortable with my goal setting? So metacognition and goal setting both inform our goals, but then they're also going to inform everything else in terms of our strategies and how we self-manage as we go into the more specific executive functions. So first are those core executive function skills where everything is rooted. All of these other higher orders come from, higher order skills. And then we have the structural executive functions. And so these are establishing our path towards the goal. So it's the planning, prioritizing, time management, and organization. And then when we start moving towards that goal and actually doing, we then are tapping into the task initiation, self-monitoring, cognitive shifting, and goal-directed persistence. And so while this looks like, oh, great, it's a process, the thing to keep in mind is people don't typically have just one goal at a time. And goals aren't always just things that are like, oh, I want to achieve this. Sometimes the goal is, I want to get through my day successfully. They're not always huge aspirations. And so while they're goal directed behaviors, sometimes it's, I just need to get through this week of work. How am I going to do that and tap into all of this? So while this is a very I don't want to say simple, a simplified version of what's constantly going on in our head, it is simplified so that we can start to pinpoint where to develop strategies around and figure out what is getting in the way of achieving our goals. So I wanted to talk a little bit about capacity versus strategy development. So when we're looking at executive functioning capacity, there's a biological foundation. And so this really is rooted in the development of the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex isn't fully maturing on average until your early to mid 20s. And so they start developing, executive functions start developing as young as like 1-2 years old. But they don't fully mature. That the part of your region of your brain where they develop doesn't fully mature until early to mid 20s. And so it underlies the core skills such as working memory, inhibitory controls, and cognitive flexibility, and thus impacts those higher order skills. And this is why us at New Frontiers, we coach people that are younger than 10, let's say, we're very realistic with the people we're working with what we're working on. I always joke, we're not going to get an 8-year-old that's managing their own calendar. They just don't have the stuff in their brain to be able to do something like that yet. It's not developmentally appropriate. So the developmental process really looks at that this matures gradually over time as the brain circuits evolve. So just the foundation for these core executive functions to even exist in the first place take time. And this represents our inherent capacity for the executive control. So you wouldn't give a 5-year-old the expectation that they can manage their days and times and know how much time is passing, the time awareness, and you just wouldn't expect that. Now, on the other end, there's strategy-based support for executive functions. These are more behaviors and approaches. And when you're looking at this, there's this metacognitive learning piece. And so this involves the learning, applying, and refining of strategies through self-awareness. So even in my late 20s, I can still struggle with inhibitory controls, especially in meetings. I always blame that I was raised as the youngest of 3 brothers with big age gaps. So I always say, like, the only way I could be heard at the dining room table was to talk fast and loud and as quickly as something came into my head. But that's not always effective in accomplishing my goals. So rather than sitting there and saying, I'm going to change my brain, I printed out a little sign that said, stop, wait, listen, think. That visual prompt was a strategy to help me through self-awareness to compensate for maybe some inhibitory control deficits that my brain might just be how my brain developed. And so there's this other side of strategy development, which is about really developing strategies to compensate for the way our brains are working. So this empowers us to choose the best tactics to manage tasks and overcome challenges. Our best tactics for my brain or our brains. And then there's this adaptive enhancement piece. And so we are developing these strategies to compensate for those limitations within our brain. Now, this may change as someone's developing. Maybe some strategies that you use when you're 12 years old are going to be different than when you're 18 years old because your brain's changing. But a key piece here is to look at, you can't really control the development of your brain. You might be someone like me that has some inhibitory control challenges as you get older. But what's key here is that the strategy development can compensate for that capacity. And on the flip end, it's understanding that capacity develops over time. So being developmentally appropriate of what you're working on at different times. The flip end for anyone that's getting a little bit older is just to share over. Your executive functions decrease over time. And so your strategies as you get older may need to change. Just because you used to be able to hold everything in your head and your working memory doesn't mean you can now. And so the strategy development piece is so important as a lifelong understanding. So it can be taught and improved with practice, leading to better organization, planning, and problem solving. So I like to just throw over this baby. Like, you wouldn't come to this baby and say, why aren't you speaking? Why can't you have a conversation with me? Why can't you write an essay? It's all clear, right? Developmentally, they're not there yet. But these executive functions are very similar to language capacity. And then on the flip end, just because someone has the capacity in their brain to learn language, if they're not taught language, they're never going to learn it. So in this case, the actual development of teaching someone speech, grammar, syntax, things like that, that is the strategy development piece. Whereas the part of the brain that allows a baby to start to develop speech is the capacity piece. And so sometimes you could just swap out in your understanding language with executive function skills. So variability in brain development. So I borrowed this from some other professionals at Reflection Sciences. They're great. Have attended some of their seminars and things like that. And so they have this beautiful little graph showing the executive function development from age 2 to 70. And so what you can see, it throws me off a little bit, but they're going year by year down here, and then they start going by 5s and 10s. And where you can see the peak really is in those 20s. Once it reaches full maturation, it starts to degrade slowly over time. But the main reason why I wanted to share this over is this chart is showing the average for the population. But everyone has an individual pace. All of our brains are developing in different rates, different paces. Different parts of our brain may develop quicker than some of our peers. And so you're following your own unique timeline for each person, and this can be influenced by genetics, environment, or your experiences. Now, I wanted to do a specific shout out over towards learning differences. And so sometimes individuals with learning differences may experience slower maturation of their executive function skills. I often, and don't quote me on this, I'm not basing this fully in science, but I often will share over to parents that are very concerned about their kids going to college. And I'll just say, look, think about them as if they were 3 to 5 years younger. That may be where their brain's at. I don't know for sure. But my favorite conversations are when a lot of college juniors, or they're in their 3rd year, let's say, and the parents are like, something just seems to have clicked. Something's falling in place with them. And what that is their brains are finally catching up in terms of those executive functions. The capacity is beginning to increase to a point that the strategies they're using are really starting to click and work. So the delay, particularly in areas like planning, working memory, and self-regulation, it's not a deficit, but it might just reflect a distinct developmental trajectory. They may get there. They may have their own journey. That does not mean that the problems they're facing when they are 17 and they're waiting for it to come up. School does not care about where your executive function development is at. School demands are going to keep going, and they're going to keep moving forward. So remember, this might be influence the capacity piece, but that does not mean there isn't a place for strategies to still come in. So these tailored strategies, by recognizing these differences, those personalized strategies and interventions become very important to optimize throughout the lifespan. So again, just like I said, I use the example of a developing brain of a teenager, but there is that flip end. What's working for me in my brain right now may be very different in 10 years because my executive functions may be degrading over that time. And that's just something to accept. But the positive aspect is you can develop strategies to compensate for those changes. And getting into that kind of growth mindset and cognitive flexibility to be able to adapt our strategies based off of changing circumstances is so, so important. So now the impact of executive functions in everything we do. They have this foundational role. They're the control center and they're guiding every thought, decision, and action. So they influence how we plan, solve problems, and navigate challenges every day. They really have a universal application. These can apply at New Frontiers. We develop different goal areas. So we look at academic goals, social goals, life management goals, career goals, personal goals, and all of these goals are influenced in how you achieve them by executive functions. And they really do have this everyday relevance of just how we navigate our day to day and navigate through life. We're using our executive functions to help us navigate. It's like that compass for our behaviors. It's helping guide us towards our North Pole, towards those goals. So just in learning and work, so with learning, some of these pre-executive skills can build the self-awareness or clear academic objectives. The core executive functions are supporting our focus, retention of information, study strategies. Our active executive functions are helping drive your engagement with work, with moving forward, overcoming obstacles, sustaining progress. And then the structural ones is creating the structure to manage our assignments, manage projects and deadlines. At work, some of the pre-executive and core executive functions, they're enabling clear goal setting, effective problem solving, and adaptation. The active executive functions, really initiating tasks, dealing with curveballs being thrown our ways, transitioning between multiple projects or multiple meetings, and ongoing performance monitoring. The worst thing is having to be told you're not doing a good job versus knowing that you're not doing a good job so you can do something about it. The structural executive functions, ensuring that all of our tasks are planned, prioritized, that we're getting ahead of problems instead of them catching up to us. And then in daily life, personal organization. So really just looking at helping manage our own routines, appointments, and responsibilities. Cognitive and emotional balance. So self-awareness, impulse control, adaptability, stress management, decision-making, personal relations, familial relations, romantic relations. Those are all can be impacted there. Action and persistence. So really looking at the effective task execution and follow through on personal goals. Overall impact. Together, these skills create a robust framework that supports academic success, workplace productivity, and a well-balanced daily life. So I wanted to highlight the impacts in the different aspects of our lives, but they really impact everything. There really is. It's hard to not point out where executive functions don't impact us. Now, before I go into some of the strategies and the specifics, I did want to share over in general about strategies. And there is an hour-long webinar on our YouTube page specifically diving into these 3 pillars, but I did want to present them over here quickly before going into some of the strategies. And so the first pillar is metacognition. So understanding your thinking to break unproductive patterns, understanding what works and what doesn't work for you, and informing strategies and identifying problems proactively. And so how do you come up with strategies that work for your brain if you don't fully know how your brain works best? Now, I don't want to say that you need to do one before the other. When you try a strategy, if it works, you learn something about your brain. If it didn't work, you learn something about your brain. So building in self-monitoring helps us see and inform our metacognition development. The second pillar is this problem solving and strategy development. So this is really where we may zone in, identify an executive function challenge that we're facing, and then we try to develop strategies to address that problem. But what I really wanted to share over is the strategy isn't the end. There's that accountability and follow through. So there's two pieces. One, how do you know if a strategy works or not if you don't actually follow through with doing it? So that accountability of following through on using a strategy can help inform whether it works or not. But then also just knowing what to do is only half the battle. And sometimes the challenge is the accountability and follow through. And now that might tap into task initiation and some of the executive functions we're talking about. But it's important to understand that strategies are only as effective as they're tailored to our brain. They're addressing problems or challenges that we're facing, and that we actually follow through with using them. And those are these three pillars here. So for time's sake, I do want to leave a little time if there are any specific questions. So, and this will all be, and I'm happy to share over this slide deck if anyone wants. You can request it over. You can even include that in the survey form if you want to see. But I want to get through just what the general strategies are here to leave some time for any questions you may have. So with metacognition, as we talked about what it is, the general strategy is really building in regular reflection and self-assessment. What worked about this? Why did it work for my brain? You know, what that might look like is things like a learning journal, reflecting, building out times, tying a strategy to what your strengths are. There's so many different iterations of this, but the main piece is regular reflection and self-assessment. And then why? Why did this work for me? Why didn't this work for me? What about this worked for me? What about this didn't work for me? Building in that time, and this is repetition. You don't just turn on metacognition one day. It really is about an ongoing comprehension of your brain and building in different strategies to continually reflect on that. Trying different methods. So here, a little cognitive flexibility coming in is another way to reflect on what works best for you. Now, goal setting. So we talked about setting clear goals. So SMART goals is a great framework to learn. So this is, I've done some full presentations on it. Let me see if I can get it right from my memory. Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound for SMART goals and action steps. The other one I just wanted to throw in also is STAG, which is short-term achievable goals. And so when you set a goal, you can make out short benchmarks, and STAG will pop up again. But really what you're doing is you're trying to break down a goal to make sure that it's something that you can actually achieve. It removes subjectivity. And that is the main basis for strategies around goal setting. Is like, this is a great way I like to think about it. Think about your future self. What type of excuses could you make for why you didn't achieve that goal? And a real good goal setting strategy is, how do I leave no room for excuse making? How do I leave it where I can actually see why I didn't achieve that goal so I can do something different? And so using the SMART criteria to study or work targets, creating to-do lists that outline step-by-step actions to reach a major goal. Then with inhibitory controls, really the general strategy here is identifying what distractions are and minimize them. And often this is through environmental control. So right now, you can't see it, but my door is closed to my office. So I know that I can get distracted. Some of you may have noticed earlier, I looked down, I got an email that does kind of need my attention. I'm going to get to it right after this, but I made the party foul of leaving my phone up. And so what do I have right now? I've removed it, by now it's face down. And so I controlled my environment, and that is a big way for distractions. When you need to focus, control your environment in some way. But also it could be impulse identification. And so I gave that the strategy before. I made a visual prompt for myself. So it was a way of when am I impulsive? What are those signals? And then coming up with different strategies to try out. So dedicated workspaces or maybe mindfulness is also a great thing that helps out with impulse control. Fidgets as well. This is really good for impulse control. Working memory. And so with working memory, looking at, so general strategy, main thing is rely on it less. So rely less on holding information in your head and make it concrete. I don't know if any of you went through the trauma of 7th grade math, of algebra, where every test said, show all your work. Well, Rebecca, you want to know why? It was because we were using too much working memory. Show your work, write out each step. So you're using less of you're taxing your working memory less. You need to remember to do 3 things, write them down. Now you're not relying on the working memory, you're relying on concrete information. Note-taking apps, checklists, really what you're doing is you're taking things that are getting stored in here, you're storing it elsewhere in the world. Cognitive flexibility in terms of general strategy, you really want to consider, like, really the base for the general strategies here is you're stretching your brain. You're stretching the neural pathways in your head. And the way you stretch is by trying different things and thinking in different ways. Try different approaches. Go through brainstorming exercises that are looking through different things. Try things differently in low stakes way. Another great just general strategy for cognitive flexibility, puns, word games, crossword puzzles, these all are tapping into cognitive flexibility, and they can help enhance your capacity for more flexibility. Another just general one is doing some if-then thinking. If I do this, then it will lead to this. It's helping you stretch your brain. With planning, really what you're looking at is breaking down tasks and mapping timelines. Stag, another general strategy I always like to share over is like, where's your master list of knowing everything you need to do? So planning is important. Like, do I have one place where everything is? So then you can map things out based off of full information. So this can be project plans or visual roadmaps using mind maps or flowcharts, digital planning tools to assign timelines and track progress. Prioritizing, really it's about considering both importance and available time. And in terms of a general strategy, tying importance to goals, right, towards the outcomes. So this does help frame things like, well, I want to play video games right now. Well, what is that giving us, right? How important is that? One may argue that it helps me stay focused. It helps me stay motivated. But as long as you're tying it towards something like, what is the importance of these tasks, can help give you a framework for prioritizing. A great framework is the Eisenhower matrix to use, and then continuously updating your task list. Time management, so that awareness of time and time estimation reflection. So really reflecting on, so like awareness of time, if you're working on this, build in some benchmarks to reflect. So maybe it's every 30 minutes an alarm goes off, so I know how much did I get done in 30 minutes? How much time went by? And then also time estimation reflection. So really the main thing here is guessing how long something's going to take you, and then reflecting on how long it actually took you. This can be things like using calendars to block off times. Pomodoro technique, time logs are great tools to use. Organization in terms of a general strategy, develop a systematic routine. Might be daily that you're going through something. I have a work colleague who makes sure that their email is always down below like 10 or 15 a day. So they close their day out with 15 emails, and that's their to-do list the next day. That's a system to organize their emails. That person gets agita when they look at my emails because I have something like 30,000 emails in my inbox. But my organization strategy is I can always search in there, or I flag emails that are really important. And so it's just about coming up with a systematic routine for yourself. Another example of a systematic routine is on Fridays, I have in my calendar 30 minutes to organize my desk. And so that way I'm always cleaning my desk throughout at the end of the week so that I start each week fresh in that sense. Now, task initiation, the general strategy here is to create starting rituals. What does starting actually look like? So if you know getting started for you is a challenge, let's make up something that does work. And really, the one part of these starting rituals that are super helpful is one small step. Think about it as getting the ball rolling. Once you get it rolling, it's easier to sustain it. So what are the small steps I can do to start? And so for me, you know how I start my morning? Cup of coffee, and I put on some music. And it's a starting ritual for me. I have the music, then I pull up my emails, and then I slowly start to get the wheels turning, and all of the other stuff starts flowing together. You can use a timer. You can establish morning routines that primes you for productivity. You can do small commitment strategies as well. Rather than saying I'm going to do this for 3 hours, that can be overwhelming. It's let me just start with 15 minutes and see how I feel. Cognitive shifting in terms of a general strategy is scheduling transition times. So I am going, and start end times are very helpful. So I am going to do this work for 1 hour. I'm going to have an alarm set, and then I'm going to take a 5-minute break and shift to my next task. Building in that specific transition time can help with addressing shifting challenges. You could also have checklists, mark task completion before moving on to the next activity, and you can log how long time things are taking. Looking at self-monitoring, so really that continuous reflecting, the general strategies is really to look at, are we setting aside regular check-in times with ourselves? If you need to do it with someone else, that's fine also, but let's actually set in check-in times. What's working, what's not? Am I on track with my goals? And then also self-monitoring skills. So a lot of us can grade ourselves on like a good, bad scale. I'm on track or off track. But sometimes having a 1 to 10 scale or a 1 to 5 scale illuminates things a bit more. So how well is this working for me on a scale of 1 to 10? How productive was I today on a scale of 1 to 10? And when you do things like you actually track some of this data using a scale, and I've had webinars on this in the past as well, and some blogs that you can check out, but using a scale helps remove subjectivity, and it helps us be able to see patterns and know when there's a problem. Okay. Then goal-directed persistence, really reflecting on incremental wins. So you want to see progress. You want to feel good about progress, especially for macro goals. You want to pat yourself on the back, but you also want to remind yourself of goals. So I do like to sometimes use that example of, so I got a photo right here. I have a couple of photos, actually. I have my goddaughter, I have my niece, I have my mom, I have my partner. Why do people put photos on their desk? Well, really, it's to help with goal-directed persistence. Sometimes you might have a crappy day at work. And what do those photos do? They remind you of why you're doing it. And so that's a goal-directed persistence strategy. Why am I doing this? It's not always because I want to do this, or this specific task. It's because I want that end goal. And so building in these reminders of what these goals are, why we're doing this, is a great way to support your goal-directed persistence. As I said, for some of these examples, happy to share over the deck for anyone who wants it, or even just have a little bit of a conversation about what some of this looks like. 2 minutes over and no time for questions. Well, there are time for questions, so I'm happy to take any questions. If anyone wanted to, I didn't get any alerts, but if anyone wanted to talk, I think you guys can. I've never been on the user end of this, so if you can raise your hands, I'm happy to either turn on your microphone, or if you wanted to type into the chat box, I'm happy to answer anything. I'm also going to just include, again, as a reminder, I'm resending the feedback form. I really, really do appreciate any feedback. But I'm also going to just share over my booking link if anyone wanted to hop onto my schedule. I'm more than happy to continue the conversation in a one-on-one setting. Maybe the questions are a little bit more um, personal or whatever they might be. But let me just pull this up while I give any time if anyone has any questions. So I just sent over my booking link in case, oh, got a question. All right. Oh, yes, I can go back to the self-monitoring slide. One second. Where are we? Okay. We're almost there. Here you go. Oh, there you go. So I teach teens with autism spectrum disorders, high anxiety, emotional control, a huge issue. Any tips? So for emotional control, helping them reflect on how they feel and trying to set a goal. And again, this is everyone's going to have an individual approach. So if they're high IQ, helping them reflect on how they felt. And then maybe sometimes trying to set the goal around, do we like to feel that way? And when you can get the buy-in from them of, I don't like feeling that way, which most people don't, then you have a partner in figuring out where things start going down. So the first thing I would do with those is, and I'm glad the other participant had to come to this slide. Self-monitoring is so important. And so one thing that I break out with some individuals is really going through, I like to call it the XYZ. So it's when I do X, it leads to Y, but then I add in the Z, which is, and it makes me feel this. And so what this does is this can help us start to pinpoint what's leading towards the lack of control. Now, once you're able to then identify where that lack of control is coming from, then you can piece out, sometimes there is actual therapeutic coping strategies that need to be worked on. So if it is more of an irrational emotional control, what you're looking at is when there's more irrational thinking leading to a lack of emotional control and outbursts and things like that, that's where CBT really does help, because that is a triggered response that's happening and often can go on autopilot. But if it's not so much an irrational line of thinking that's leading to that lack of control, then it's more about piecing out, well, what triggers that? And then what can we try to do instead? Right? And so sometimes it's that they're just having a knee-jerk reaction. When this happens, this happens. What we want to try and do is figure out what's triggering that and then give an alternate. But they, at first, when you give them an alternate, they're not going to know to access that alternate route, because the existing behaviors are the established neural pathways. So not only do we need to help them identify the triggers, we then need to help them access the alternate routes. And so if you're working in a classroom setting, let's say, you may want to work on signals. So if a student is starting to feel emotionally dysregulated, maybe they have some type of signal. Maybe they go like this. Make something like collaborative, like it's your game that you're working on. And then when that happens, that first step is identifying when the emotional dysregulation is coming in. Then you can work on strategies together of, well, what's something we can try out and let's see if it works. And so I know when I used to feel emotionally dysregulated in school, or if I was feeling distracted, what I did is I would take a lap around my school. I'd go to the bathroom. Even though I didn't have to go to the bathroom, it was a way for me to regulate myself. And so the first step that I would really work on is helping see the buy-in from them that this isn't helping them, that they don't like to feel this way. Because if they do like feeling that way, then there's no amount of executive function strategies that are going to help because there's no goals to work on there. But if they see that they don't like feeling that way, that they're in control of it, then you can start building up strategies of how do we know when it's about to happen and what can we do instead? And involve them in that process. Don't just tell them the strategies, but involve them. What are some things you think you can do? And I think working on that together. All right, let's see. So you have calming rooms. I think I'm there. That's great. I think that's another thing also. You don't want to reward the going down to the calming room so much because that could then actually encourage the behaviors. I like being in the calm down room. I like being there. And so trying to really think about what those incentives are, putting in some timing for it and building it out. But I'd love to talk more if you'd want to. I'd love to speak more about this. But I think really trying to hear them, have them in the driver's seat. The most important thing is you need access to what's going on in their head. And so really pulling them in to be participants with you in the process is super important, and have it be their goals of what they want to achieve. And you might need to get there incrementally. And so it's not about all at once. And that might be a very case by case basis for them. Brain breaks is an amazing one as well. Laps around the school, things like that. Another thing I found with school age kids is sharing over how you do things like this also, especially with an autism community. They can feel like they're a problem, that they're different, and some humanizing factors of how you do things to calm yourself, right? What that does for you. And so the other way, I know I said earlier about setting the goal of really connecting over what you do to, how do you know, or sorry, you don't like feeling this way. So now let's work on it. But you want to do that same kind of XYZ. I do this, it leads to this, I feel this. You don't want to only do that for negatives. You want to also highlight the positives. So when my classmate upset me and I was feeling dysregulated, I went for a walk and then I felt a lot better. You want to connect that positive framework as well, not just the negative. Because if it's only negatives that you're using that framework, then they're going to just think they're a problem, versus, oh, this is something we all do. And so I use a lot of sharing my own experiences as well to normalize these things, that I get upset too, and I need to use strategies like this. It could be that you used to take laps around the school when you're feeling emotionally dysregulated. Makes it feel a lot less like an other for them and more general. Let's see. Okay. Any other questions? I'm glad I saw another comment. Glad it could be helpful. I always like to share over. You got a medical team. If there ever is a time that you're struggling with that follow through, that's why we sometimes have a job, as executive function coaches. It's just like I always compare this work to a personal trainer at the gym. You might know, like, your doctors are telling you, oh, you need to lose weight. You need to get into shape. Here's Ozempic, but you still need to go to the gym. Like, just medication and things like that sometimes isn't enough to help you develop behaviors and strategies. And sometimes there is a role for coaching to help keep you moving forward and have someone to talk through all this process with. Okay. Any other questions? Well, on that note, as I said, I shared over those links if anyone wanted to set up anything else. And if there's anything else, I do these once a month. So any other topics that you may want to see, please share over. All previous ones are put onto our YouTube page, so you can check that out as well. It's something else that is sometimes useful. And I do think sometimes these recordings, I'm not going to be putting up the question and answers on them. So this could also be something that's useful to share over with other people who may benefit. So keep an eye out for that stuff. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the night and an amazing week. Bye-bye.